Defense mechanisms were first described by Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, in 1874 in a paper called Neuropsychosis of Defense. Freud identified strategies that we use to protect ourselves from suffering. He said that defenses are mechanisms for managing thoughts, feelings, impulses, and fantasies that are potentially threatening or not acceptable. In other words, mechanisms are like psychological techniques that our minds use to protect ourselves from emotional pain. What are the characteristics of these mechanisms? Defense mechanisms operate in our minds to reduce distress, and they do that by falsifying or distorting some aspect of reality that we find unacceptable or excessively threatening. These mechanisms are essential for survival. Without them, we would be flooded with anxiety and discomfort whenever we are facing an uncomfortable situation or a difficult one. In this sense, defense mechanisms can help us. We've all been in situations where we deny, at least temporarily, that something is difficult going on. We've all been in situations where we idealize someone that we admire, or even using humor to cope with stress. All of these are examples of how our minds protect us from anxiety. Even though these defense mechanisms can help us, if they are too rigid, they can keep us disconnected from the world, inside and outside world, and they can also impede our growth. These mechanisms are unconscious, they happen outside of our awareness, and in a way they make us distort slightly some aspect of our reality that otherwise we would find unbearable. These mechanisms are not inherently good or bad as long as the distortion of their reality is minimal and that the mechanisms that we use are not rigid, then they can be effective. Some authors don't agree with the term defense because it makes it sound like an obstacle, something to overcome, or a sign of a problem. But defenses, far from being problems, are crucial for our healthy functioning. What is potentially unhealthy about defenses is when they become too rigid and they distort reality too much. So, how do we know when a defense is adaptive or not? It's when it effectively reduces the pain, our emotional pain, while keeping us connected to the world, inside ourselves, and outside. So, what are some examples of the defense mechanisms that we use? I'm going to talk about a few of them, not an extensive list. And we're going to take a look at how they can be seen in our daily lives and the ways in which they help us or hurt us, depending on the situation. Denial is a defense mechanism in which someone unconsciously denies their thoughts, desires, behaviors, needs, or some aspect of reality which he deems unacceptable. This is a common mechanism when dealing with grief. Initially, some people may be in denial of the loss of an important person or situation. Or someone may be in denial of the severity of a certain situation because they find it incredibly stressful. For example, someone's being in denial of having a severe illness may decide not to take care of themselves because they're not fully aware of the severity of the situation. In this case, denial may be considered maladaptive. It keeps person from feeling anxious at the expense of their own health. Repression is another mechanism which involves keeping unwanted thoughts and feelings out of our awareness. These thoughts may have been conscious and then repressed, or they may have never reached awareness in the first place. We can tell when repression is operating, for example, when someone has a loss of a memory of a specific incident or time of their lives, especially traumatic. Every time we repress a memory, feeling, or thought, these things are no longer accessible to our consciousness. However, these things do not cease to exist and may show up in other ways, such as dreams, etc. Compensation is another defense mechanism, and it means exactly what you probably think it is: making up for a lack, trying to overcome the lack of something in our reality. While some people see compensation as a defense mechanism, others, like psychologist Alfred Adler, argue that compensation is a natural part of life. It represents our natural effort to overcome our sense of inferiority. For example, someone who smokes may try to compensate this bad habit with exercising and eating healthy. For example, someone who smokes may try to compensate this bad habit with exercising and eating healthy. For example, someone who smokes may try to compensate this bad habit with exercising and eating healthy. For example, someone who smokes may try to compensate this bad habit with exercising. One mechanism that we're all familiar with is identification. Identification involves modeling ourselves after someone else that we admire. This happens when we take the feelings, attitudes, traits, etc. of someone that we love, admire, but also it could be someone that we fear or hate. While it's natural to model ourselves after someone that we admire, identification can also be used to protect ourselves from anxiety and conflict. For example, a child may take on the aggressive traits of their violent parents because their violence threatens him. In order to deal the anxiety of living in a violent home, a child may take on that role instead by identifying with the aggressor and therefore disidentifying from their victim role. Omnipotence is a mechanism that involves someone showing an unrealistic and highly inflated sense of themselves. This mechanism can trick people into believing that they have more power than what they actually have. This defense can be seen as an attempt to control others and how they perceive and act. Projection is when someone attributes to others unacceptable thoughts and feelings that they have but are not conscious about. This can happen, for example, when we reject parts of ourselves that we're ashamed of or that we deem bad. Some people tend to project those bad parts onto others so that they don't have to face those bad parts in themselves. This is how projection operates. Conversion is a mechanism in which someone reduces their acute anxiety by transforming it into a physical symptom. This happens, of course, unconsciously. When conversion happens, the psychological suffering becomes physical and keeps the person unaware of its actual cause, therefore experiencing a little bit less anxiety. Some argue that conversion is an attempt to deal with the object loss. The physical symptom becomes some sort of a symbol of a loss that cannot be remembered, so it gets lodged in our bodies. What's interesting about the defense of conversion is that it's highly relational, it always involves others. Conversion keeps people connected in some way or another. Why? Because conversion alarms us into seeking help or alarm others into offering help when our symptoms become physical. Idealization involves creating an ideal impression of a person, a place, or an object by emphasizing their positive qualities and neglecting the qualities that are negative. We often idealize the image that we hold of the people that we admire, such as relatives, celebrities, teachers, partners. When we do that, we emphasize their more admirable qualities and don't pay attention to the other ones. Sublimation involves converting an impulse from a socially objectionable aim to a socially acceptable one while still retaining the original goal of that impulse. For example, if someone is struggling with strongly aggressive impulses, they may turn that energy into something more healthy and productive, such as sport. Sports can be then a sublimation of aggressive instincts, in which a mild form of aggression is released in a socially appropriate way. Displacement involves shifting feelings or conflicts about one person or situation onto another. For example, someone who's unconsciously angry at their partner may find themselves extremely irritated with a coworker, so the anger has been redirected to another person. Undoing is an attempt to undo a negative or undesirable behavior by doing the opposite. For example, Let's say a child takes money from his parents without permission and then volunteers to do the dishes in an attempt of undoing the thing that he shouldn't have done. Or someone feeling annoyed or hostile towards a partner may then bring them flowers in an attempt to undo some of the harm from those feelings. Humor, it's another defense that we've all used at some point in our lives. This is a defense mechanism too because it protects us from the unbearable anxiety and other forms of emotional pain when confronted with a difficult situation. Humor is considered a mature defense because it doesn't alter reality in the same way that the others do. Someone can have humor as a defense mechanism, and their relationship with reality doesn't have to be impaired. Using humor as a coping mechanism helps us slightly alter our perception of a situation, and then we can see it as a less threatening one. Humor helps us keep our ability to think even in the face of confusion and anxiety, and keeps us in our capacity for amazement and wonder. The mechanism of turning against the self involved turning unacceptable impulses or thoughts that we have towards someone and we turn it towards ourselves. Let's say, for example, that one has unconscious hostility towards someone that they love, but becoming aware of those feelings would lead to a lot of anxiety. In this case, the hostility is turned inward, and then this helps to decrease some of the feelings of guilt for feeling hostile towards a loved one. The mechanism of turning against the self is quite common in cases of childhood abuse or neglect. In order to survive, a child of abusive parents may blame themselves for the abuse that they suffered. It's as though they were thinking, well, if I was a good child, my parents wouldn't scream at me. I must have done something wrong to deserve this kind of treatment. In doing so, the aggressive impulse are turned against oneself, and then the child protects their parents by making them infallible. Reaction formation is a very interesting one. Like repression, it involves keeping certain thoughts or impulses out of our awareness, but in this case, the mechanism works by replacing the impulse in consciousness with this opposite. For example, if someone has a hostile feelings towards a loved one, they may act or feel excessive kindness and gentleness. For example, a partner that censors their angry feelings towards their partner may act in a particularly loving way whenever they feel irritated or mad. So far, we've discussed how these defenses operate in individuals. But what about the defense mechanisms in our societies? Do you think that different cultures adopt different mechanisms to collectively deal with our anxiety and emotional pain? Let's take a moment to think about this and wonder how these mechanisms show up in our daily lives as a community. So far, we've discussed how these defenses operate in individuals. But what about the defense mechanisms in our societies? Do you think that different cultures adopt different mechanisms to collectively deal with our anxiety and emotional pain? How do we displace our aggression? What do we collectively repress as a society? What kind of things we don't remember because they're too painful? What are some of the realities of today's world that we're collectively denying? Who are our collective heroes? Who do we idealize? And who do we demonize? Do we sometimes believe or act as though we are omnipotent? And what's the belief underneath that? What is the fear that we're protecting ourselves from? In which ways do we split the world into good and bad? When the world inside and around us becomes too painful, defense mechanisms come to the rescue to allow us to create a safer reality. Learning about the defenses that we and others use can give us important insights into our individual and collective fears, conflicts, and anxieties, and the things that our minds do to protect ourselves.